In the high desert plains of Durango, Mexico, a construction crew began excavating foundations for a new residential development on the outskirts of the city. The land had been unremarkable for decades: dry, sparse vegetation, scattered rocks, just another plot awaiting modern progress. But beneath the surface lay secrets that had remained undisturbed for over 500 years. When the first shovel struck something harder than earth, the workers assumed rubble. Instead, they discovered an underground chamber with perfectly arranged stone walls, sealed by ancient masonry. Inside lay human remains, arranged in ritual formation, surrounded by obsidian blades of extraordinary craftsmanship, pottery with geometric patterns, and artifacts bearing symbols no one could immediately identify. What should have been a routine construction delay became an archaeological puzzle, one that would attract archaeologists, rival treasure hunters, and questions about who these people were and why they had been hidden so carefully. The discovery forced an uncomfortable choice: report everything to authorities and risk the site becoming protected land, or explore privately and risk breaking laws designed to preserve indigenous heritage. Two brothers caught in the middle, one an engineer on the project, the other an amateur historian, would soon realize that the answers buried in that chamber came with dangerous complications. Someone else had been watching this land, and they had very different plans for what lay beneath it. Chapter 1. The Ground Speaks. The pneumatic drill fell silent at 7:47 a.m. when Miguel's equipment struck something that sent vibrations up through the handles and into his bones, a sound different from rock, hollow and resonant. He killed the engine and wiped dust from his face, squinting at the spot where the drill had bitten through. The crew chief, Roberto, walked over with coffee in hand. "What happened?" "Something down there," Miguel said, kneeling. The hole showed not loose soil but something darker, layered. He ran his fingers around the edges. Stone, cut stone, shaped and mortared. "This isn't natural." Roberto crouched beside him, his weathered face narrowing. In 20 years of construction across Durango, he had hit many obstacles: bedrock, old pipes, lost irrigation channels. But this was different. The craftsmanship was too deliberate, the mortar too old. He used his radio to halt all drilling on the site. By noon, Miguel had called his brother David. David was a high school history teacher who spent weekends researching pre-Hispanic settlements in the region. If anyone could make sense of what lay beneath the foundations, it would be him. David arrived within the hour, muddy boots and a worn canvas bag filled with reference books and a camera. He descended into the excavated pit with a flashlight, Miguel following. The beam caught the edge of the chamber, a rectangular opening, perhaps 3 meters below ground level, its entrance sealed by a carefully constructed wall that had begun to crumble where the drill had pierced it. "How long has this been here?" Miguel whispered. David didn't answer immediately. He was studying the mortar, the style of the stonework, the geometry of the entrance. His hand trembled slightly. "Centuries," he finally said. "Pre-Columbian, almost certainly. Possibly Durangense culture or maybe Calcu-height. The construction method." He trailed off, clearly torn between academic excitement and the weight of what they were looking at. "This is a burial chamber, Miguel. Someone important was buried here, and it's been sealed intentionally." That evening, after the site had been cleared and the excavation temporarily halted under the pretense of geological assessment, the brothers stood in David's apartment surrounded by maps and archaeological journals. The chamber's dimensions matched descriptions in academic papers about indigenous funerary practices in northern Mesoamerica. The obsidian they had glimpsed, black volcanic glass sharper than modern steel, suggested wealth, ritual significance, and expertise that required trade networks reaching hundreds of kilometers. "We need to contact the university," Miguel said. "The INA, the proper authorities." "And then?" David asked quietly. "You know what happens. The site gets locked down. The property becomes protected. Your development stops. Investors pull out. Maybe the family whose land this is loses everything." Miguel didn't answer. Both brothers understood the conflict that lay ahead. The law existed to protect heritage. But the law also threatened livelihoods, and not everyone would accept that trade-off silently. From a cafe across the street, unseen through the apartment window, a man in a dark jacket photographed them through the glass door. He had been watching the construction site for 3 weeks, ever since rumors began circulating among collectors, whispers of a significant find in Durango, of obsidian and old bones, of a burial chamber untouched by looters. He was not an archaeologist. He was someone with buyers in Mexico City and beyond, people willing to pay fortunes for artifacts that would disappear into private collections, never to be seen by scholars again. He made a phone call. By morning, he would have 2 associates in Durango. The race for the chamber had begun in earnest, though Miguel and David did not yet realize they were no longer alone in their discovery. That night, Miguel lay awake listening to the wind across the desert, thinking about the bones arranged so carefully beneath the earth, about hands that had placed obsidian blades 5 centuries ago, about choices that could not be unmade once the chamber was opened. Somewhere beneath the city in the dark, those secrets had been waiting. Now, they were stirring. Chapter 2. The Obsidian Truth. David spent the next morning in the university library, cross-referencing everything he could find about Durangense burials and the use of obsidian in pre-Hispanic funerary contexts. His colleague, Dr. Patricia Mendez, a professor of Mesoamerican archaeology, noticed his intensity and asked him directly what he was researching. He almost lied. Instead, he found himself telling her about the chamber. Patricia's reaction was immediate and conflicted. As an academic, she was thrilled. A sealed, potentially undisturbed burial site was extraordinarily rare. But she was also cautious. She knew the legal maze, the politics of archaeological claims, and the unfortunate reality that many sites had been pillaged by people claiming ownership of land. "You have to report this, right?" she said firmly. "Not for me, not for the university. For the people who were buried there. They deserve proper study, proper respect. Anything else is just looting with a better narrative." David knew she was right. But when he met Miguel that afternoon at the construction site, his brother had news that complicated everything. "The property owner is facing financial pressure," Miguel said quietly. They stood at the edge of the excavation pit, speaking in low voices, even though the site was temporarily empty. "The investors are threatening to pull out if development stops. The owner is talking about filling in the chamber, covering it back up, and moving the foundations to another location on the property. That's destruction of a cultural site," David said, horrified. "It's also his land," Miguel replied, "and he's struggling. If we bring in authorities, yes, the chamber gets protected, but he loses the development project, and probably his property too. The legal process will take years." They descended into the chamber as evening shadows deepened. With proper flashlights this time, they could see more clearly. The obsidian blades were arranged in patterns, some hafted to wooden handles, others standing alone, their edges still sharp enough to cut. There were clay vessels with intricate geometric designs, a jade pendant carved into the shape of a bird, and at the chamber's center, human remains arranged in fetal position, surrounded by what appeared to be offerings of corn kernels, now desiccated to dust. David photographed everything methodically. The bones showed no signs of violence, no fractures or markings suggesting sacrifice or conflict. This was a death from natural causes, treated with great ceremony and respect. The person had been important. On one wall, barely visible beneath centuries of dust, there were symbols carved into the stone. David traced them with his fingers and his breath caught. "These are calendrical marks," he whispered. "They're dating the burial. Miguel, look. If I'm reading this correctly, this person was buried during the period of Durangense territorial expansion, maybe 1300s or early 1400s. That's when they heard the sound. Above ground, at the edge of the construction site, a vehicle had arrived. Men were moving quickly, carrying tools, examining the perimeter. Miguel climbed out of the chamber first, David following, and both brothers froze as they watched 3 strangers systematically photographing the excavation pit from every angle. "Can I help you?" Miguel called out, his voice steady despite the tension rising in his chest. The man in the dark jacket turned slowly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just interested in local development," he said in Spanish, accented with a northern lilt. "Investors looking for opportunities in Durango. You work the site?" "Construction engineering," Miguel said. He moved slightly to position himself between the man and the pit. "The site is temporarily halted for geological assessment. Private property." "Of course," the man said. "No problem." He and his associates moved back to their vehicle, but they didn't leave immediately. They sat in the car, watching, waiting. As darkness fell completely, Miguel and David understood with sudden clarity that their discovery was no longer secret. And the clock had begun ticking. Chapter 3. The Rival Hunt. By the next morning, David had confirmed his calendar reading with Dr. Patricia. The symbols in the chamber corresponded to the early 1400s, a period when the Duranguense culture was experiencing significant territorial consolidation. Whoever lay in that burial chamber was likely a leader, possibly a warrior or regional administrator of considerable importance. But the confirmation brought little comfort. The men in the dark jacket had returned twice during the night, and neighbors reported seeing them examining the property line with measuring tools and taking soil samples. "They're grave robbers," David said bluntly during a phone call with Patricia. "Or collectors working for grave robbers. They want the artifacts. They probably have buyers lined up." "Then we move faster," Patricia replied. "I'm calling the INA regional director today. We need legal protection on that site immediately, even if it's just a preliminary injunction. Once government agencies are involved, random excavation becomes federal offense." "And the property owner loses everything," David said. "The alternative is that priceless cultural heritage disappears into someone's private collection," Patricia said. "And honestly, David, if those men get to that chamber first, there won't be anything left to save anyway." Miguel arrived at David's apartment that morning looking exhausted. He had barely slept, torn between duty to his employer and duty to something larger than business. "I've been thinking about the chamber," Miguel said, "about why someone would seal it so carefully, hide it so completely. In most pre-Hispanic burials, even important ones, there were markers, signs. This was deliberately concealed. Maybe there's a reason." They drove to the regional INAH office, where Patricia was waiting. She had already prepared documentation, photographs from David's initial exploration, and a preliminary site assessment. The director, a woman named Elena Rojas, who had spent 30 years protecting archaeological sites in Durango, listened carefully. "I need to visit the site personally," Elena said, "and I need to do it today before any complications arise. David, you'll show me exactly what you found. Miguel, you'll need to secure the property and prevent any unauthorized access." The team arrived at the construction site at 3 in the afternoon. Elena descended into the chamber with professional efficiency, her trained eye cataloging everything. The construction techniques, the arrangement of burials, the obsidian weapons, the pottery, the symbols. When she emerged, her expression was grave. "This is significant," she said. "Potentially a high-ranking individual from the early post-classic period. The obsidian alone suggests trade connections extending to central Mexico." She turned to Miguel. "I'm issuing a preliminary protection order. No further excavation without INA supervision and authorization. This site is now under federal protection." That evening, as Elena's team began the preliminary documentation process, the dark-jacketed man and his associates arrived once more. This time, they saw the INAH vehicles, the official signage, the government presence. The man's face went dark with anger. He exchanged words with Elena in heated Spanish, then withdrew. "This isn't over," his accent made clear. "You've complicated this, but there are other ways." As night fell, David stood at the pit's edge with Miguel, watching the stars emerge over the Durango desert. The chamber was no longer theirs alone. It belonged now to history, to the law, to the larger obligation to understand the past rather than exploit it. But they both understood that the grave robbers' retreat was only tactical. The battle for the chamber's secrets had only just begun. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. Obsidian Secrets. The INA excavation proceeded methodically over the following 3 weeks. Elena Rojas led a team of 7 archaeologists and specialists, and David was permitted to assist as a researcher and documentation assistant, an arrangement that kept him close to the investigation while providing academic legitimacy. The chamber revealed itself layer by layer. Beneath the surface, obsidian and ritual objects lay a more complex story. The individual buried there was male, approximately 40 years old at death, with markers suggesting significant physical labor in life. Scarring on the shoulder blades consistent with carrying heavy loads, likely military supplies or tribute. Isotope analysis of his teeth would eventually show he had traveled extensively, living in at least 3 different regions during his lifetime. The pottery bore symbols identifying him as someone associated with a tributary network extending from Durango northward. He was not a local leader but an administrator, a collector of tribute, a representative of a distant power. The obsidian blades were extraordinary. Some bore workshops marks traceable to sources in Hidalgo and Querétaro, hundreds of kilometers to the south. Others were from local sources. The variation suggested this person had been someone important enough to accumulate wealth through trade networks and warfare tribute. But it was David who discovered the anomaly. While cataloging smaller artifacts, bone needles, shell ornaments, jade beads, he found a ceramic fragment buried beneath the primary skeleton. It bore a maker's mark, a small symbol pressed into the clay. The symbol was not consistent with Durangan style. It was Aztec. He showed it to Elena immediately. "That shouldn't be here," Elena said quietly. "If the burial dates to the 1400s, as your calendar interpretation suggests, Aztec influence in Durango would be unlikely. The Aztec Confederation was still consolidating power in central Mexico during that period. They wouldn't have reached this far north for another 50 years. Unless this burial is more recent than we thought," David suggested. "Unless he was killed during an Aztec military campaign, a conquest attempt." Elena's expression shifted. "Or he was enslaved and brought north, escaped, and was buried by people who found him. The obsidian makes sense then. Aztec warriors were famous for their obsidian weapons. They brought the fragment to a colleague who specialized in ceramic analysis. The results came back 3 days later. The clay composition matched sources from the Valley of Mexico. The firing technique was definitively Aztec, and the age, based on archaeological context and style, placed it between 1480 and 1510. The implications exploded through the academic and local community. An Aztec presence in northern Durango during the late pre-Hispanic period suggested either military expansion or slave trading networks that historical documents had never clearly documented. The burial wasn't just a local leader. It was evidence of contact between distant cultures, of conflict and displacement, of histories that had been largely forgotten. But the discovery also attracted unwanted attention. A journalist from Durango's primary newspaper arrived, wanting to write a story about the Aztec warrior burial. Local indigenous groups requested involvement in the excavation, claiming rights as descendants. University administrators from Mexico City called Elena, suggesting that such a significant find might benefit from analysis at national institutions. And the dark-jacketed man and his associates began appearing again, this time more openly, photographing the site and making inquiries about artifact catalogs and storage locations. "He's planning something," Patricia warned David during a late-night call. "Collectors, especially ones with connections to criminal networks, don't simply give up. They adapt. He probably has contacts in local government or university administration. He might be trying to arrange a theft during the storage and transportation phase." On the 21st day of the excavation, Elena made a decision. The primary remains and all ceremonial objects would be transported immediately to a secure facility in Mexico City, under armed guard, before any opportunity for theft or interference. The chamber itself would be photographed exhaustively, then carefully sealed, protecting it from future looting. "This person deserves to rest with dignity," Elena said during a meeting with David and Miguel. "And the story they can tell deserves to be told by science, not treasure hunters." Once these artifacts are properly studied, once we understand who this person was and why they were here, that knowledge will be more valuable than any private collection. Miguel felt the weight of validation in her words. The choice to report the discovery, despite the complications for the property owner, had been the right one. The chamber would be protected. The history would be preserved. But that night, as the artifacts were being carefully packed for transport, Miguel received a call. The property owner wanted to meet him urgently, not at the construction site but at a cafe in the city center. When Miguel arrived, he found the man looking older, more weathered, worn down by the complications the discovery had brought. "I've been offered money," the owner said quietly. "Significant money, to delay the transport, to create an accident, to allow access to the site for a few hours." From the man in the dark jacket? Indirectly through intermediaries I don't know. The owner pushed an envelope across the table. "Enough to clear my debts and keep the property. All I have to do is make a small mistake, an unfortunate security lapse." Miguel stared at the envelope without touching it. "And if you refuse, then I lose the property eventually anyway through legal complications. But I remain clean. I remain someone who can sleep at night." The owner slid the envelope back across the table. "I wanted you to know I was tempted. I wanted someone to know that I chose not to. Maybe that matters." Miguel nodded slowly. It did matter. Not much, in the larger scheme of things. But something. Chapter 5. The Grave Robber's Gambit. The artifacts reached Mexico City safely. The chamber was photographed, mapped, and sealed with government documentation. The Obsidian weapons and ceremonial objects entered the Iona collection, where they would be studied for years. Their story gradually revealed through academic research and carbon dating and analysis of trade networks. But the investigation into the grave robber network continued quietly, pursued by Elena Rojas and federal authorities. The man in the dark jacket was identified as part of a larger criminal organization that had been trafficking in pre-Hispanic artifacts for over a decade. His network included corrupt officials, private collectors with international connections, and logistics specialists who arranged smuggling across borders. 3 weeks after the chamber was sealed, Mexican federal police arrested the man at an airport in Mexico City, attempting to board a flight to the United States with forged permits for transporting ceramic samples for analysis. When they searched his hotel room, they found detailed plans, architectural sketches of the Durango site, photographs from his surveillance, names and contact information for buyers in the United States and Europe, estimates of the artifact's black market value. The estimates were staggering. The Obsidian collection alone would have sold for nearly 2 million pesos to private collectors. The complete burial assemblage would have been worth 4 times that, worth enough to make the crime worthwhile, worth enough to justify violence if necessary. Elena called David with the news. He was planning to excavate the chamber himself during a break in the INAA schedule. He had connections to security personnel, people he thought could delay response times. If it hadn't been for the immediate transport to Mexico City, if the artifacts had remained on site for even another 48 hours. She didn't finish the sentence, she didn't need to. The burial chamber's existence became public knowledge through official channels. Media across Mexico reported on the discovery, the Aztec warrior, the evidence of pre-Hispanic trade networks extending farther north than previously documented, the significance of the Obsidian assemblage, the attempted theft. Archaeological conferences began discussing the implications. Universities requested detailed data and photographs. Indigenous groups organized ceremonies, acknowledging the burial and the new understanding of their ancestors' connections to distant peoples. David published his initial research findings in a regional academic journal. Miguel was credited in the acknowledgments for his role in discovery and site protection. Patricia gave lectures about the significance of the find. And Elena Rojas became something of a local hero for her quick action in securing the artifacts and shutting down the grave robber network. But the chamber itself remained sealed, protected, waiting for future archaeologists with new technologies, new questions, new methods of reading history from objects and bones and symbols carved into stone. One afternoon, David and Miguel stood at the edge of what had become a protected archaeological zone. Yellow cordoning marked the perimeter. An information sign explained the significance of the site, directing visitors to the INA Museum for detailed information. The construction project had been abandoned. The property owner's debts were settled through a combination of grants and subsidies from cultural protection organizations, compensation for the loss of development rights. "Do you ever wonder what he would have wanted?" Miguel asked, gesturing toward the sealed chamber. The man buried there. If he knew his grave had been preserved, studied, turned into a historical record instead of being robbed or forgotten. "I think," David said carefully, "that people who achieve enough significance in life to be remembered 500 years later probably understood the value of legacy. They probably understood that history mattered more than any individual life. So yes, I think he'd be satisfied." Chapter 6. The Weight of History. 1 year after the discovery, the INA released its complete preliminary report on the burial. The skeleton had been that of a high-ranking Aztec military administrator, likely someone who had survived a failed military expedition into northern territories during the late 1480s. Carbon dating and isotope analysis confirmed David's calendar interpretation. The man had traveled extensively across the empire during his life. His teeth showed he had spent time in at least 5 different climate zones, likely moving through military campaigns and administrative assignments. The Obsidian assemblage included weapons and tools collected across decades, pieces from workshops in Hidalgo, Veracruz, and Querétaro. The jade pendant bore symbols associated with the water deity Tlaloc, suggesting the man had been connected to elite priesthood or military rank. The pottery surrounding him included items manufactured in central Mexico and locally in Durango, indicating trade and contact between the Aztec Empire and northern peoples. Most significantly, the grave contained evidence of a leg injury that had healed badly, leaving the man partially crippled in his final years. He had been carried, possibly as a slave or prisoner, possibly with honor as a distinguished elder. The care taken in his burial, however, suggested the latter. He had been treated with respect, given ritual offerings, surrounded with the tools and wealth he would need in the afterlife. Someone had cared for him. Someone had ensured he was remembered. Elena Rojas organized a symposium in Durango, bringing together archaeologists, historians, and representatives of indigenous communities to discuss the implications of the discovery. The chamber itself was opened once more under controlled conditions, allowing academic analysis and cultural consultation. Descendants of Duranguense and Aztec peoples were present, offering their own interpretations of what the burial meant, how it fit into their understanding of their ancestors' histories. David gave a presentation about the discovery process, the significance of the obsidian, the evidence of trade networks. Miguel attended, listening from the audience, still marveling at how a routine construction project had become a window into 500 years of history. After the symposium ended, David and Miguel returned to the sealed chamber one final time. The entrance had been reinforced with additional protective barriers. A locked gate prevented unauthorized access. But through the security fencing, they could still see the dark opening, the layered walls, the spot where they had first glimpsed the obsidian blades. "We changed something," Miguel said quietly. "By reporting it instead of covering it up, we changed what this site means. To history, to knowledge, to the people whose ancestors lived here." "Would you choose differently if you had to do it again?" David asked. Miguel considered the question seriously. The property owner's financial troubles had been difficult. The development project's cancellation had affected the local economy in small ways. The grave robber network's exposure had created a minor scandal in the regional government. These were real consequences, genuine complications. But the burial chamber had been preserved. The man's life and history and connection to distant peoples and ancient networks had been rescued from oblivion. Knowledge had been gained instead of stolen. A piece of history that might have disappeared into a private collector's vault, appreciated by only a few wealthy individuals, had instead become part of the shared human heritage accessible to scholars and students and anyone interested in understanding how civilizations connected and influenced one another across vast distances and centuries. "No," Miguel said finally. "I wouldn't choose differently." They stood together as sunset painted the Durango desert in shades of orange and deep red. The wind carried the smell of dust and ancient stone. Somewhere beneath the earth in the sealed chamber, the obsidian weapons still held their sharp edges, the jade pendant still bore its carved symbols, and the remains of a man who had traveled across empires remained in carefully arranged dignity. Finally at rest, finally part of history. The true treasure, David thought, was never the gold or the obsidian or the rare jade. It was this, the knowledge, the connection across centuries, the understanding that human beings in ages past had lived with complexity and ambition and purpose, had built networks and traveled far from home, had mattered enough to be remembered. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.